So we have today, or in this session, we have Nikhil, Sachdeva, and Carlos from T&E that you already met. I'll just give a brief introduction to you, Nikhil. Nikhil is Roland Berger's global lead for Aerospace and Aviation Sustainability, and the principal in the London office. He leads Roland Berger's work into how the aviation sector can transition to climate neutrality, from sustainable aviation fuels to hydrogen to electrical propulsion, and to addressing non-CO2 effects, most importantly here today, as well as commercial and technological implications for the aerospace, aviation, and fuel sectors. So with these words, I'll give the floor to you, Nikhil, and then understand that you have shared a presentation among you. Joachim will control the clock, so we'll try to have 5 minutes towards the end for questions. So floor is yours, Nikhil.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we've been given the post-lunch shift, so hopefully people can stay awake through this. That's at least part of our goal. Okay, so let's get into it. So I'm actually very thankful to both Christoph from TUI as well as Paul from the Aviation Impact Accelerator for already teeing up this kind of question, right? So Christoph, in his very kind of practical, these are the results from our test, this is what we've done at the airline level, etc. He has begun answering the question, are the practicalities of actually doing contrail management a showstopper? It seems like, at least at the TUI level, they weren't a showstopper. They're not easy, nothing is easy, but it wasn't a showstopper. Then Paul said something, which I appreciated, so thank you, Paul, for saying it just in advance of lunch, which is that we don't need to have perfectly precise prediction tools for contrail mitigation or contrail avoidance to be explored further. So if practicalities aren't a hindrance, if the quality of the prediction tools aren't a hindrance, the question now is cost a hindrance, right? And I would ask you to think about, if we can prove to you that cost is not a hindrance, what should be the hindrance? That's the question I'll leave to you, and maybe that's a question I would like to almost ask the audience at the end of this talk. So three parts to it, and very happy to be sharing the spot with Carlos as we go through. First of all, as a strategy house, Roland Berger, we do cost estimates all the time. We do financial estimates all the time. But to be able to do that, what we always need to begin with is some kind of future conception of what the future world looks like that we're actually modeling, right? So while we've shared some of our numbers publicly before, some of you may have seen some of that in the past, what we've not really shared is a visualization of the ecosystem that we're imagining. So first I want to walk through what is that vision, right? And there's a couple of variations within that. Then I'll talk through our high-level estimates and all the various complex and sorry, I'm going to use the word again, uncertain assumptions, before then handing over to Carlos for T&E's estimate, which then really build. I think they fit quite well together, I would say, in looking at the numbers from a slightly different perspective. So what is that vision? So first and foremost, and sorry for the post-lunch complex page, but I promise there's a couple of cartoons coming up in a second. The way we kind of simplistically, and we have to be simple when we're looking at 25 years into the future, there needs to be some kind of simple way of thinking about it. Simplistically, we think about it in 5 steps, right? So we begin with data that has to be integrated from various sources, right? There's some computation that needs to be done to then be able to generate an impact on a plan. Now, we already know, Alejandro was speaking about it earlier, that this has begun, right? In, let's say, smaller ways today, but that needs to be scaled up. The flight plan, as per usual, needs approval. There's an actual flight that happens, so there's some in-flight optimization that may also be part of the story. And then, whether it's for the airline's own reporting and own understanding, or whether it's to be passed on to customers, whether it's cargo customers, corporate customers, or just people going on a holiday, there should be some kind of reporting, some kind of post-flight analysis that says, hey, because you flew our airline today, we were able to mitigate X% of the total climate impact, which includes Y% of contrail mitigation. Right, so that's the post-flight aspect of all of this. So as promised, here's the first cartoon. So 5 steps in this one as well, right? So we have the data gathering, now trying to visualize all the different sources. Again, this is not meant to be complete. This is meant to be a view, right? And there's probably a multitude of alternative views here, right? But this is what we've assumed as part of our cost analysis. So number 1, there's airlines reporting, pilots reporting, sensor data being captured. There's satellite data coming through, whether those satellites are dedicated for contrails or not. That's a question, but there should be some kind of observation data coming through. There's also weather service data, and there's also ground observation data. And the idea is that this is then brought together into number 2, into some kind of ISSR prediction model. Because before we can overlay what the planes are going to be doing, we need to know, well, here's where we think the ISSRs are going to be. Then there's the overlay of the plans from the airlines. Then there's an approval of that plan. There's an amendment to that plan. And then, of course, in a pre-flight sense, which is what this is trying to visualize, what we call strategic contrail avoidance. It's pre-flight. This is the plan itself has been amended. So that's some of the approaches that are already being looked at. You can then avoid the contrail if you think one was there for the flights where we actually see them going through an ISSR, and then report back to your stakeholders, whoever they might be. There's also what we call tactical contrail avoidance. So just to kind of illustrate the difference, the vast majority of that chain doesn't really move, right? But in this case now, there's an actual in-flight amendment that can also be done. So these two avoidance methodologies are not, they can coexist. They're mutually compatible. You might have a plan that you were going to do X, and now you have to change it because there's more data that's come through. And we can imagine, and it's very much visualizing it as, as turbulence avoidance is done today. There's an ongoing live kind of data source that pilots are continually being updated about. No one wants to go through a turbulence cell. No one will hopefully in the future want to go through an ISSR. So that's the way that we've thought it through. Now, next few pages I'm just going to rush through, but we've thought about then if it's this kind of combined universe, a bit of strategic, a bit of tactical mitigation, who bears the cost? So that brings us to the estimated cost of actual management. So we first asked the question, who's going to bear the cost for what types of activity? Where are those costs actually going to be? And then we can quantify those, right? So three types of activity in the 3 columns, right? There's upfront costs in research and trials, which, by the way, we don't imagine will only be upfront. We actually think it's going to keep going for a while, even once this thing scales up, if it does. There's of course, capital expenditures, right? So as it says, this could include observation infrastructure, it could include sensor infrastructure, shouldn't be underestimated, should be evaluated as to what it could mean. And then there's of course, operational expenditures. Now, fuel burn has already been spoken about quite a bit, correctly so, but there's also other OpEx categories. And where I say stakeholders, what we've done, and I'm not going to present all these slides in detail, but if you're interested, we can share them afterwards. But for each of those 3 activities, for research, for CapEx, and for OpEx, we've gone cost category by cost category and just said, okay, who's going to bear the cost? Which stakeholders are actually going to be paying for something? And is that going to be a large amount of money they pay, or a medium amount of money, or a small amount of money, or basically zero? That's the beginning of what we do. And unsurprisingly, I'm going to come to this chart, unsurprisingly, fuel burn does turn out to be one of the most impactful cost categories. So I'm going to spend a little bit longer on that one. And we can get into the assumptions on all of our other cost categories as well. But on fuel burn specifically, we lean quite heavily on this really fascinating 2022 paper in Nature Climate Change, which was really a meta study in which a lot of different sources, you can see the actual underlying studies. So, Roland Berger isn't making these numbers up. These numbers are very much from the scientists, but we're simply reading off a chart. But the choice of how to read off the chart is something we've made. So let me explain how we did that, right? So we basically said, okay, let's assume that the goal is to mitigate 80% of contrails. That's an assumption number 1, right? Then if we are making that assumption, and here's a line of best fit, maybe that's our base. So that works out as just over 2%. Our downside case in terms of fuel burn is maybe the upper limit of this very simple chart, and then the optimistic case can be the lower limit. Very simple. The second thing that we then assume, which is the second column here, is every flight to be deviated, or is it just those flights that generate contrails according to all our modeling? And we've had loads of internal debates about this. We could assume that actually every flight in the world is going to be deviated, but that's not really the conversation we're having in 2025, right? We already have evidence and we already have data and we've already had some tests. It seems like a realistic future will include only a proportion of flights actually being deviated, which we think is excellent, right? So then not every single flight needs to be impacted by this. So in our downside case, we take approximately 20%. In the base and optimistic case, it's really a study result, we take about 14%. And if we multiply through, very simplistically, right, just those numbers multiplied by these numbers, you get to the numbers on the right-hand side, that in the downside case, it's just under 1% at the system level of additional fuel burn. Base case about 0.3%, optimistic case about 0.1%. And so now I'm going to have 2 or 3 pages about the actual costs. So first and foremost, we've got GWP 100. We've got our downside case, our base case, and our optimistic case. You've got the different cost categories lined up on top of each other. I'm going to show you a fuel burn breakdown out of the OPEX in just a slide. But what we very clearly see is, even in the downside case, contrail mitigation costs around £7. This is in pounds, so let's say $9, $10. It's of the order of about a slightly more expensive than average offset. Right? That's kind of where we are in the downside case. In the optimistic case, it could really be a lot better. You can see some of the assumptions at the bottom, in terms of number of sensors that we actually have to deploy. That's an open-ended question. We don't know how much these will cost necessarily. We've made some assumptions. But what I'd really like to emphasize on this page, and this is where I'm very glad that Carlos is speaking right after me about this, we've not assumed certain degrees of conservatism. Okay? And this came up in the previous discussion about, I'm sorry, I have to say it again, uncertainties in the analysis, right? So there's 3 that I'd like to really point out. That we've not assumed a world in which not all contrail mitigation will succeed. We've assumed, and by the way, these are 2040 numbers, so 15 years in the future, we've assumed that we will learn that when we're about to actually spend the fuel on mitigating a contrail, it works, right? We've also then assumed that there will be a solution to the false positives and false negatives issue that we were just discussing before lunch. And we've not made allowances for that. We've also not yet looked at the impact of operational disruptions. So let's go back to, again, what Christoph from TUI was saying this morning. They're going to actually be trialing this over a week in the summer. The summer is the worst time, especially in Europe. It's extremely challenging already from an ATM perspective, from an airport management perspective, from a slots perspective, basically all ops is confusing and complex. In that world, can we imagine that if you have to deviate 20% of your flights, approximately, that is going to cause a knock-on impact on every other part of the ecosystem? Probably, right? Probably. We've not taken that into account. So I just want to point that out, that this analysis is still ongoing. There are some improvements, and actually, Carlos is going to walk through how they've layered in some of these additional elements of conservatism in their numbers, which are a bit more conservative than ours. But then let's get to a bit of a comparison, right? And this is a slightly controversial chart. So let me begin with a big caveat. We are not suggesting under any circumstances at all that contrail mitigation should be done instead of carbon mitigation. Of course not. The question here is it in addition to, and is cost a hindrance or not? And when we look at a chart like this, again, we looked at GWP 100 on the previous page, but there's also GWP 20 and 50 versions of that. Obviously, the cost appears a lot lower when we give more credit in terms of CO2e to contrails relative to CO2. But regardless of metric, at least when you look at costs, right? This is 2 orders of magnitude lower than the social cost of carbon. It's also approximately at least 1.5 orders of magnitude less than other things we're doing in carbon mitigation. Right? It just makes it very clear. that even if we are wrong by, I don't know, 10x, 15x, 20x, it's still a good thing to do. It still makes sense to do, not instead of, but in addition to these other things that we just take for granted. Yes, of course, we're following through with the Refuel EU, as we should. Yes, of course, we're working on developing hydrogen aircraft, as we should. We're not questioning those kinds of investments, at least in a forum like this. So for us, from a cost perspective at least, we should not be questioning whether or not cost is an issue. Cost does not seem to be at least a hindrance for contrail mitigation. One last slide, and then I'll hand over to Carlos. We also map this over time. And there's this really interesting dynamic. So first of all, in dark blue, we have the fuel share of the OPEX, right? That's easily the most expensive part of all of this. In the light blue is other types of OPEX, so it's ongoing training and ongoing maintenance and improvement of systems that you've set up. But in dark gray is CapEx. And what we find is that you need to invest several $100 million upfront at the start of whenever this activity starts. Now, we assumed that the activities will start roughly upon the conclusion of the MRV. It's an assumption, right? You could just shift the chart left or right, depending on what you believe. But that's the assumption we took. And it is interesting that upfront, there will be some additional costs. We'll have to deploy sensors, we'll have to either deploy new satellites or make amendments to existing observation on the ground. There are upfront costs. And the upfront costs will probably be in the first 3 to 5 years. Then there's like a stabilization. So sensors, we assume, will have to be replaced. So it's not like you deploy the sensor and then that's it. You never have to worry about it again. This is a humidity sensor. All the data suggests that actually there is a lot of maintenance required. We assume that they'll improve, but we don't assume that they'll be perfect. So that's the kind of thing that's behind this. And I just want to point out then, last point, then over to you, Carlos. In our estimate, we stabilize by around 2040 at $2 billion a year. And this is for 80% contrail mitigation. Now, I just mentioned that we've not been conservative in some ways, but basically we're assuming that contrail mitigation works. We've assumed a vision of the future in which we found a way to make this thing work, to come up with this cost estimate. $2 billion a year, and we get rid of possibly what could be half of the effect of aviation. I just want to leave you with that number. $2 billion a year. It's actually not that expensive, and it works out as somewhere between 1 to 3 pounds, so let's say $2 to $5 a ton of CO2 in the GWP 100 case. So with that, I want to hand over to Carlos.
Thanks, Nikhil. Quick introduction of T&E for those who don't know us. We're a Brussels-based clean mobility NGO, and we do evidence-based advocacy. So a lot of the publication that we publish go through a big level of scrutiny, and for good reason, because that's really what we do, and credibility is one of our key assets. So before analyzing contrails, which we published a briefing last November, we told ourselves, let's save those people who are going to be turning every stone of our publication. Let's save them some time by taking a very conservative stance and by showing that even in a very pessimistic scenario, contrail avoidance is really a no-brainer. So we were quite happy to see the publication of the RMI report last year with Roland Berger cost estimates, and we thought it's a really, really great economic analysis. And we took it and we tweaked it a bit to adapt it to a European case for 2040. So the first thing we did, we took a lower climate base case. So instead of the contrail impact of Lee, we took that of TIO from 2024, which is still within the error bar of Lee, but the lower estimate. For CapEx cost, we took the model from Roland Berger, which we believe is very well documented and very comprehensive. And for OPEX, we basically simulated the cost of fuel, which, as you've seen from the previous slides, makes up the most of the operational costs. We assume a fuel burn penalty at fleet level of 0.5%, which is between the central and the pessimistic scenario for RB. And for 2040, we looked at what is a likely scenario of fuel costs. So Refuel EU 2040 targets 2/3 fossil fuel, 24% biosaf, and 10% eSAF. So when we put all those costs together, plus the assumption that we are reducing half of contrail warming, because we would only address 80% of contrails, out of that we assume 80% of the times we will be correct in the deviation, and for each correct avoidance maneuver, we will reduce 80% of contrail warming for that flight. So that's 80 cubed is a reduction of 50% in total warming. We come to a figure which is between 3 and 20 times higher than what Nikhil has just showed to us. Here we do a comparison with other well-known climate solutions. And we wanted to also kind of boil it down to what does that mean for a passenger? What is the real impact? So we crossed this information of cost per ton of CO2e abated with the impact of the average impact coming from the TO analysis per airport pair for 2019. And luckily we're getting free coffee here, but if we had to pay for it, still it would be more expensive than doing contrail avoidance on both inter-European and transatlantic flights. So we're talking about around about 1.5 euros for inter-European flights, less than 5 euros for transatlantic flights. And bear in mind that this is for 2040, so the baseline ticket is also higher. In terms of percentage, we're talking about less than 1% in both cases. So that was very quickly the analysis we made. Once again, we relied on the great work from Roland Berger, and we wanted to adjust it to a European scenario to make it also a bit more evident and a bit more easy to communicate to passengers and policymakers. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you. And time for questions, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to see, I mean, real cost estimates and certainly at a low and acceptable level. Any questions in the audience for Nikhil or Carlos? Yeah, I can see Andrew.
Thanks, Soren. Andrew Chen from RMI. I really appreciate the overview here and definitely get the different approaches in terms of conservatism. One question I have maybe for future work in thinking about this, it seems as though most of the cost assumptions are equally spread across the entire aviation sector. But in reality, from an operator basis, you're going to have concentrated effects of that cost, right? So in theory, that ticket price change could also be more concentrated on certain routes or certain airlines. So is that something that you're thinking about in future work in terms of what that could actually look like in 2030 or 2040?
Yeah, no, thank you. Maybe I take that first and then you can jump in, Carlos. Definitely part of the kind of next iteration of this. Now we know, for example, to your point, right, that the most highest density of warming contrails are over the North Atlantic, the contiguous US. You know, there's specific parts of the world which are particularly warming, and there's actually specific parts of the world which are particularly cooling. And so if we do make the assumption, as we have, that we will figure out how to only address the flights that we should be addressing, then the reality is that the costs will most likely, assuming that's correct, mainly be borne by northern airlines. Let's put it that way. Exactly what split is to be confirmed. What I would stop short of doing, and I know that airlines are going to possibly be asking this question, so I'm just going to address it now. No, I don't necessarily believe that airlines should be paid if they're generating a cooling contrail. I don't think we're necessarily there yet. Maybe one day, but I don't think we're there yet. But yeah, those costs will not be evenly spread on every ticket.
Yeah, and just to explain a bit more our analysis, we did take that granularity into account, meaning that the routes we've shown, we've taken the actual average contrail warming for an airport pair, and we multiplied times the cost per ton of CO2e. Now, we took transatlantic routes crossing that very heavy area of contrail formation and intra-European flights as well. But if we had taken the route between, say, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, maybe the contrail cost will be way lower. So that's already part of our analysis there.
But is it a problem? Is it a problem? I mean,
No.
it will be borne by the passengers, won't it, at the end of the day?
Yeah.
I just asked whether it was a problem that it would be unevenly distributed. I mean, passengers on routes creating the biggest amount of contrails should have pay the highest cost, shouldn't they? And even given that it's very small cost, it's not an equity issue.
No, so I think it comes down to equitability of the cost of climate change, that sort of thing. Let's imagine a world, it's not the world in which we live, and I take heart in that, by the way, but let's imagine a world in which all the warming contrails were only over developing countries, right? Then it would be a concern. Oh, well, only those passengers are having to pay for this. So, you know, we might end up reopening that sort of debate. But I take heart in the fact that actually where we have found warming contrails in high density at the moment tends to be more in more developed parts of the world. So I actually think, personal opinion, I think it's actually a good thing if we have the tools and the models to be able to accurately account and give those passengers that are actually avoiding the contrails the cost, because it just so happens that they're more likely to be able to pay for it anyway.
Yeah, and the routes we've seen there are probably the most exposed to this problem. So cost will be the upper bound, and then from there we lower it. And at the end of the day, of course, we're going to be balancing out these costs with all the routes that a given airline is operating.
I saw one more hand. Do we have one more question before closing this session? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so there's fuel costs, and you just have to pay the fuel producer more, I suppose. For the staff costs, like air traffic control, pilots, are you assuming that basically like who takes on the cost there? Is it like the aviation workers could get paid more for this? Or is it just because there's more work to do, so that they'd need more staff? Just quite a good, from an aviation worker perspective, there's quite a nice angle here, talking to unions, it's like we can get a climate reduction and there's more employment, there's a win-win as well.
No, it's a really interesting point. So the only assumption we've made is that it'll be that body that actually needs to do the work that gets their share of the additional cost, right? So someone will get paid to do this, and by all means, there should be a small profit margin as part of that. So the way it gets allocated within that group is, of course, TBC, right? It could be exactly as you're saying. It could be more money for individuals, or it could be more individuals. We don't know that, right? That's to be worked out. But it is in that group, just to kind of visualize that's how we thought about it.
Well, simply say that higher costs, but which should translate into more staff pay, more people working high quality jobs and staying here, staying in Europe or wherever the airline operates. So from a worker's perspective, it's a positive story, yeah.
And actually, if I can add something, so we talked about resources in terms of people in more operating roles, which is essential. But something that is quite excellent, I think, is a lot of the technologies being developed to be able to address this are actually being made in Europe, right? So there's a really good story about kind of intellectual property being in Europe, on the sensor technology, or on the tools that actually have to be used to mitigate these issues. And if that IP can stay in Europe, for example, that could be more jobs, it could be more gross value add. So that's part of the story here as well.
So thanks a lot. Let's give Carlos and Nikhil a hand. Thank you again for this positive message.
Thank you.